Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled Solar Energy in North Carolina, a 2021 View. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Farmer. I'm a senior engineer and a technical consultant with Advanced Energy, and I will serve as your host and moderator for today. Today's webinar is part of Advanced Energy's Exploring North Carolina Smart Grid webinar series. This is the third of 3 webinars hosted this year as part of this program, and the 17th since we began the series. Advanced Energy is a nonprofit energy firm founded in 1980 by the North Carolina Utilities Commission that provides research, testing, training, consulting, and program design. Our members are Duke Energy, North Carolina's electric cooperatives, and Dominion Energy. Since 2017, our team of technical and training staff have collaborated on this Smart Grid webinar series to provide stakeholders with the convenient option to learn how Smart Grid is changing North Carolina's future. Before we dive into today's presentation, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, if at any point you want to interact with us, please submit your questions or comments by clicking the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We'll respond to as many of your questions as we can at the end of the program during our Q&A session. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ncsmartgrid.org website. We'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording, and you can also review any of our past webinars on this site. Finally, following the webinar, there'll be a participant satisfaction survey. We welcome your feedback, so please take a few minutes to complete the survey to help us improve our webinars in the future. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of utility-scale, residential rooftop, and community solar, share information on current generation mix trends in North Carolina, review the latest regulatory developments around solar energy, and discuss the economic impact of solar energy across the state. Today, we're honored to have 2 invited guest speakers who are well-versed in the area of solar energy engineering, operations, and policy. First, I'll provide a brief overview of the status of solar energy in the U.S. and in North Carolina. We'll talk about where North Carolina stands nationally in terms of installed solar capacity, particularly utility scale, community, and rooftop solar. Next, we'll hear from John Guida of Strata Clean Energy. Mr. Guida is principal engineer and serves as internal technical consultant for all areas of Strata's businesses, particularly in the area of utility, integration, and interconnection. John has over 30 years of progressively advancing roles in the industry and has led many efforts to develop new engineering standards and study methodologies to raise the technical capabilities of engineering groups in distribution planning, power quality and reliability, DER interconnections, and transmission protection. He received his BS in electrical engineering from the University of Arkansas and MSEE from NC State, and is a licensed professional engineer in North Carolina and other states. Then finally, we'll hear from Mara Farber of Duke Energy. Ms. Farber serves as Duke's Distributed Energy Technology Strategy and Policy Director for North Carolina. Her early utility experience was at Southern California Edison, where she coordinated the company's energy storage strategy and later served as short-term planning manager, where she managed a team that developed the strategy and day-ahead bids for the Cal ISO energy market. She completed a Master of Environmental Management at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University and her MBA at UNC's Keenan Flagler Business School. We're grateful to be joined by our panelists today. Before we hear from our guest speakers, let's look at the status of solar generation in the U.S. This chart from the DOE's Energy Information Administration shows historical and projected new and retiring generation in the U.S. The bars below the horizontal axis indicate plant retirements, while those above indicate new generation. Note particularly the coal plant retirements shown by the black bars coming in the next 5 to 10 years, and the solar additions shown in yellow through 2050. As you can see, it's projected that solar and natural gas will be the major sources of new generation going forward. Looking strictly at solar over the past decade, we see that utility scale solar, shown in light blue, has been the main contributor to solar installations nationally. Residential and commercial PV make up most of the remainder. This explosive growth in solar generation has been enabled by the declining cost shown by the yellow line on the chart to the left. As for North Carolina, we currently rank 4th nationally with a little over 7 megawatts of installed solar capacity through the first half of 2021, and we rank 11th in solar energy jobs. For context, when we presented our first solar energy webinar in 2017, North Carolina was ranked 2nd nationally with 3 megawatts capacity. Despite more than doubling our solar capacity over the past 4 years, Texas and Florida have moved ahead. Also for North Carolina, utility-scale solar accounts for most installations by a large margin. Residential rooftop, shown in the darker blue, barely registers until 2018 following the passage of House Bill 589, which we'll hear about more later. In fact, while residential rooftop is growing nationally, as shown by the chart on the left, North Carolina still ranks quite low, with less than 1% of households. One option for people to participate without installing solar panels is through community solar programs. These allow customers to share in the benefits and participate in renewable generation without investing in solar panels of their own. It's also a viable option for people who live in multifamily dwellings or rental property or whose homes don't receive adequate sunlight. There are several community solar projects across North Carolina, particularly in cooperative and municipal utility areas. Community solar isn't a major contributor, but it warrants mentioning. As we mentioned before, and as this map shows, utility scale solar is the major player in the North Carolina solar market. These are the larger solar farms, typically 1 megawatt or larger, built with the primary purpose of supplying energy to the local utility. We'll hear more about utility scale solar in our next presentation. And now it's my privilege to turn the presentation over to our invited guest speakers. And first we'll hear from John Gaida of Strata Clean Energy. John?
All right, David, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today. And as David said, you're going to hear a little bit more about utility scale solar. So what we were going to kind of cover here from my perspective, and especially from Strata Clean Energy's perspective, is what has happened here recently with solar in North Carolina. If if we talk about what utility scale solar is, that's probably a good thing to kind of get out of the way. David mentioned a minute ago, generally a megawatt and larger. Some people want to define it as 250 kW or larger. Kind of depends. You see a picture there of one of Strata's early installations. I think that photo was an installation from here in North Carolina dating back to 2012. Utility scale solar can be also very large. It can be 100 megawatts or more. Really, there's not a functional upper limit to it. It is typically ground mounted, and it can be fixed tilt or it can be tracking. And we really have we've seen both types installed in North Carolina. Functionally, utility scale solar didn't really exist in North Carolina before about 2008. That's probably generally true nationwide, but I'm sure some existed a little before that, some other places. But that's confirmed for North Carolina. That's confirmed with EIA data and some other information. But some of the first 1 megawatt installations started showing up around 2008. These days, people use these terms FTM or BTM, front of meter or behind the meter solar. So I just wanted to throw those terms out there. Might be helpful for you to connect this to things you hear in other places. And really, when we talk about utility scale solar, we're talking about front of meter is what that's referred to, connected directly to the utility distribution or transmission system. That was preceded historically by behind the meter solar, as in rooftop, David talked about a minute ago. And rooftop started in North Carolina before utility scale solar did. The megawatt values are not as high, but that started based on my own experience, kind of in the 2005-4 sort of time frame. So it had about frankly, a little bit earlier than that. But nationwide, it had about a 10-year head start to front of meter solar. David showed a few statistics like this, but just showing a few things just a little bit differently. I thought it was interesting to look at some EIA data that shows the total number of power plants in the United States, and these are roughly defined as, from what I was able to see in EIA data, was things about a half a megawatt and larger. And so EIA shows there to be over 10,000 power plants in the United States. These can be small, these can be large, connected to distribution or transmission. But it's interesting to see on this US map, North Carolina kind of highlight here, not completely in the highest category like California, but it's interesting to note that there are, I believe it's over 600 power plants in North Carolina, and over 1,100 power plants in North Carolina. You see a lot of the yellow there, and we're going to look on the next slide. The yellow, of course, is solar, but so we've got about 38,000 megawatts of total generation capacity in the state of all types. And if we go ahead and now and just kind of say, okay, well, what piece of this is solar? And well, 672 of those 1,100 some plants are solar. It's important to talk about, without getting too deep in the technicals, I believe it's very important to talk about the difference between capacity and energy. The capacity value, the nameplate output of the plant at maximum output, which of course for solar is right there in the middle of the day, that's over 5,000 megawatts right now in North Carolina, again, according to EIA. And similar to a graph that David showed, you can see in the right here, this is a really graph of when the solar really showed up in North Carolina. And as you can see, we started this graph here in 2008, and you see it took a rapid uptick and kind of leveled off. The North Carolina state tax credit expired in 2015, so that was kind of a notable piece of this story, and a number of things have happened along the way. Those are capacity numbers you see there. Energy generation as of 2020. North Carolina solar generation was 7.2% of North Carolina's energy picture. That's interesting to compare to 2.3% of the United States. So just like David mentioned, North Carolina has moved, I think, back and forth in the last few years between second, third, and fourth in the nation, depending on how you want to measure it. You can clearly see here from a percentage basis, there's a significant amount of solar energy in the state, and it's very significant compare it to the U.S. Picture. So this is a very busy graph, and I don't want you at all to kind of drift around. For those of you that have seen these charts, and I've got 4 of them here in series, for those of you that have seen these, you know what these are. For those of you that have not, it's a type of chart that U.S. government's been producing. Lawrence Livermore National Labs has been producing, I believe, all the way back to 1950. And here in recent years, they've been producing this type of chart for not only the United States, but also for individual states. And I thought it was notable here. We're only really going to pay attention to the upper left corner here, where solar is drawn out. And this is really a total energy picture. And to be clear, this is not just the electricity grid, it's total energy picture. So you see in 2010, 0.1% of the energy picture in the United States was solar. And to be clear, this is energy, not capacity. So this is kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, that sort of thing. Measured here, as you see in BTU, but that's okay, there's a conversion there. So it's effectively same as kilowatt hours or megawatt hours with a conversion factor. So 0.1% in 2010. And if we were to fast forward now 9 years in the US, there's an order of magnitude change, okay? The US has now gone from 0.1% solar input to 1%. That's pretty notable. What about North Carolina? Well, if we look at the North Carolina picture, let's go back to 2010, 0.02% as opposed to the US being at 0.1. So definitely if we look at 2010, and I mentioned that was the beginning of utility scale solar, just a few years before that here, In other parts of the US, there was a lot of rooftop already occurring in places like California. So clearly in 2010, North Carolina, was the picture was rather small. Now, what about 2019? Well, this is where I think the picture is really kind of stark. As opposed to the U.S. having gone through a 10 times or one order of magnitude change in 9 years, North Carolina has gone through 117 times change. If you go from that 2/100ths of a percent to 2.7% of the picture is solar. And a little fact down there in the bottom left, you see, that it's 6.6% in 2019. I believe I mentioned earlier, 7.2% in from the electric generation perspective, 7.2% in the year 2020. So throwing a lot of numbers here, but I think hopefully what you take away from this is there's a marked increase in solar occurring nationwide and occurring here in the state level, but clearly this has been a notable decade, North Carolina from a solar perspective. So let's talk about some more specifics of North Carolina and kind of what's been going on since 2008. Speaking from a Strata Clean Energy perspective, we went and kind of looked at our recent data. 600, and not Strata, of course, but all solar plants. I think I quoted a minute ago, 672 facilities. And a good little portion of those are Stratas. In 2021, as we looked back about a year, there's millions of dollars of economic impact, going to the state in additional property taxes and in landowner lease payments. Since I've been involved at Strata Clean Energy, and I've been primarily working on the O&M side of the business, which is really taking care of and operating the plants that are here in the state, it's been notable to see the field force. We've got about 115 field employees. Again, this is just Strata, number of other companies and facilities out there, but got 115 field employees, about 35 office-based, and these are a little on the conservative side. I was criticized a little here inside Strata for using these numbers a little on the conservative side, but those of you that know me know that I like to kind of stay on that side of things. Arguably, the office-based employees number could be much larger than that, just based on other employees that are here working out of the Durham headquarter building and some other places. But those numbers there clearly represent the force that is operating and taking care of the facilities that are here in the state right now, which is for Strata is well over 100 facilities. The other thing I really wanted to talk about was the operational advances, and kind of this is part of the picture of, I believe, of solar maturing in North Carolina, which I think is fascinating, and it's maturing elsewhere. But the fact that North Carolina has had such a large utility scale solar picture has just continued to be unique. There are large utility scale plants, very large plants in other parts of the country. But the fact that that kind of medium sort of scale, and a lot of them were around 5 megawatts, that medium sort of utility scale sort of plant came online here, and so many of them came online in a number of years. That's clearly part of North Carolina's unique picture. So, what kind of things have happened in the last decade that maybe the industry wasn't well familiar with, kind of in the quote unquote early days? One of these things is maximizing, production using some relatively new technology, using drones and artificial intelligence. So, really anybody that operates a large set of geographically spread assets, which would, also be a utility or any type of, company doing anything like that, you're always looking for ways to be more efficient, use technology, because you can use people but you've got to spread them over a wide area. So you're looking for ways to become more efficient. This technology has really benefited solar. It's been out there for a couple of years now, and one of the things that the drones and AI is used for is to identify partial plant outages. So kind of hard to tell here, but this is kind of a grainy image, but an image taken of a module string. Essentially, all of those individual rectangles are what we call modules or panels, several hundred watts rated apiece, and all arranged in a in a string. And you notice this red box here is showing a set of modules that are a little bit of a lighter shade than what's directly around them. When they show up to be like that, and depending on the time of day, that indicates that those modules are not producing what they should be compared to the modules around them. So with that being the case, then of course we want to identify that, because just walking around in the field, you don't immediately know that it's not doing something because it's not making any noise or anything like that. And you can't even directly tell it all the time through measurement. You might think, oh, well, don't you have an instantaneous meter kind of on this thing at the inverter level? Well, you do, but at the inverter level, you're capturing many, many series parallel combinations of modules. And so if a portion of those happens to be out, you wouldn't necessarily capture that at the inverter level. So using this technology is hugely valuable. Taking the aerial scans and then using AI to then produce something like you see below starts to show us, we can process those images, and then we can clearly start to tell, oh, okay, we've got, it appears this specific set of modules is out. Dispatch technicians, they begin to go, and they may find something simple like a DC fuse blown or something else. And paying close attention to that on a regular basis maximizes the production. When you think about it, the fuel for a solar farm is photons coming out of the sky, and any photon that does not get converted directly into electricity is like sending water over a dam. You're never going to be able to put it back. So you want to be able to keep that production level up. So this is a great piece of technology and something that the industry has advanced on. With respect to grid integration, daily production forecasting has been another area that has greatly advanced. The early forecasting methods were based on simple regional irradiance. The pyranometer is essentially an irradiance sensor that is out there, and then temperature factors in, because some of you may not be aware, but temperature impacts the production on a solar panel. They actually operate more efficiently when they're cooler. And you can't do anything about the temperature, the ambient temperature, but you can use it to inform what the total production of the facility is going to be. So a lot of analytics have been put towards this, but now that technology advances have occurred in things like cloud indexes, water vapor, a lot of satellite-based imagery and information, ground albedo, which looks at reflection off of the ground. That turns out that's important, because now the industry is starting to use bifacial panels, where you actually have panels that generate off of both sides. So a lot of this additional data can be now factored into forecasting methods. And in certain areas, Strata has some involvement in operating facilities in the PJM interconnection, and in that area, it's very important to get daily production forecasting to the grid operator, because that's something they need to operate on a regular basis. Strata has been partnering with NC State with their Freedom Center, looking at ways to improve forecasting accuracy going back for a little over a year or two now. So, all right, well, slide over here. So this is something kind of near and dear to my heart that I have worked individually and particularly on, and kind of in the topic of grid and resource reliability. A new inspection program has kind of shown up here in North Carolina, and Strata specifically worked very closely with Duke to look at facilities that have been coming online ever since back in 2012. There's been a kind of I'd just call it generally a concern about how quickly some of the facilities came online, growing age of the facilities, various things like this. And, is there a concern to grid reliability? Is there a concern to the reliability of the resource itself? There's two different reliability pictures out there. The solar operator, just like any power plant operator, is interested in a good capacity factor and interested in a plant that is always operating to its maximum capability. The distribution or transmission system grid operator here, Duke or Dominion or anybody like that, Electric Cooperative, Muni, they are very interested in seeing their system's reliability be unimpacted by anything that connects to the grid. They want to see it, be the same or better. So some of these things have been brought together here recently, and I would say that many of these facilities came online before there was really a well-developed mutual understanding between utilities and solar operators on exactly how these facilities worked, what sort of facilities were in them. And there was a very recent order that actually came out of the Utilities Commission here in North Carolina to address this issue. And the new inspection program, which is kicking off now, is looking at specifically the point of interconnection facilities. If you look in that middle picture there, you kind of see a number of overhead poles that are connecting from the utility grid into the solar farm. So it's going to look very closely at some of those facilities which have the potential to impact the grid. And the other area that I'm personally very excited about is the grid interactive and inverter settings management. And managing the settings that are inside an inverter that are very grid impactful will continue to be a very important thing going forward. NERC has actually issued reports in the last year or two about this sort of thing. And so it's great to see utilities and developers really kind of working together in this area and advancing the management of these settings. So yeah, I hope that gives you a good picture of kind of where things are at today in North Carolina with solar. And David, good time to hand it to you.
Okay, thank you, John. That was great. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Maura now.
Great. Well, thank you for having me today. Very happy to get to talk about what's going on with solar in the state of North Carolina from the Duke Energy perspective. I'm the Distributed Energy Technology Strategy and Policy Director, and so I focus on the North Carolina area specifically. Just to sort of level set, here's the territory for our two utilities. You can see Duke Energy Carolinas is in green, Duke Energy Progress is in light blue, and not only are we two utilities, both utilities cross both states. So sometimes when we're thinking about planning activities, we're planning utility-wide, which means across the states. So although today we're focused more on North Carolina, you'll understand why some of my references are across states and some of them are North Carolina specific. And you'll also see while we're a healthy portion of the state of North Carolina, there are areas that are serviced by other utilities in the state as well. So sometimes when you're looking at stats about how much solar DEC and DEP have, it's not quite the same as how much solar is in the state because there are areas outside of our territory as well. All right. Just to build on some of what you've already heard about the growth of solar in the state of North Carolina, with DEC and DEP, we have about 3.7 gigawatts of capacity in North Carolina already, and this slide represents what's in the pipeline. So you can see a healthy number of bubbles in the state of North Carolina, a lot of green bubbles, which are advanced development. The yellow is under construction, and the bubbles in North Carolina are many, but slightly smaller than some of the other states. And that might partly be due to sizing in North Carolina. We're not like Texas or California or the desert where you have huge swaths of open, flat land for development necessarily. But we also have some regulatory reasons why there are a lot of projects that are 80 megawatts and below for solar in North Carolina. So that's another reason why the size of our projects in the pipeline might be different than in other states. But I think this is nice evidence that we do have a lot in the pipeline and a lot happening in North Carolina. All right. So to talk a little bit about the history of regulations that have impacted solar in our state, I mean, we can go way back to 1978 and the establishment of PURPA, where really the intention was to make sure that utilities were purchasing renewable energy from small power producers at a fair compensation, and every state has their own determination of how to set that compensation, that avoided cost rate. So it does fluctuate state to state, but there's been that policy in place for a very long time. And thinking about in our state in particular, we've had leadership in the renewable energy field back 20 years with this NC Green Power program. The Utilities Commission approved the first statewide voluntary renewable energy program in 2003, or launched in 2003. And it gave customers an opportunity to essentially pay a little extra for this clean energy product that they wanted, but couldn't necessarily build for themselves for whatever reason. And NC Green Power helped get the renewable ball rolling in the early 2000s. And then in 2007, there was Senate Bill 3, and this established the REPS program, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio. And in passing this bill, North Carolina became the first state in the Southeast to support a renewable energy portfolio standard. And for the utilities, that started with 3% of the North Carolina retail sales in 2012, and then that goal grew over time to 12.5% for 2021 and beyond. And for the co-ops and munis, that target went up to 10%. So by creating this renewable energy mandate, it created a broader market for solar and for renewable energy credits in the state, and it pushed solar forward despite it not being a least cost resource at that point in time. Of course, fast forward, the cost of solar keeps dropping, and so the North Carolina avoided cost rate for those PURPA projects started looking really attractive, particularly for facilities that were under 5 megawatts, and they could have a fixed rate guaranteed for a 15-year contract. So before too long, we have this proliferation of small solar in North Carolina, and that's really why North Carolina has sort of an unusually large number of smaller facilities, those less than 5 megawatt facilities on the distribution system, all kind of fed from this regulatory construct. And having so many projects with this locked in avoided cost price for 15 years, there's a lag in how the avoided cost rates are updated. So it started to become evident that these older rates were higher than the updated and newer rates. And so this all led to House Bill 589, which was a major collaborative effort across state and government bodies, solar developers, large business customers, nonprofits, utilities. There are a lot of folks at the table to craft HB 589. And this program, this law, contained programs for both residential and business customers. It established solar rebates in the state, community solar program, the Green Source Advantage program, which is really directed for larger customers. And importantly, it also addressed PURPA reform, both through how it changed the interpretation and contract length for those qualifying facilities, but in establishing the competitive procurement of renewable energy, what we call CPRE. So CPRE does have these long-term 20-year contracts, but it also requires competition among the developers that want those contracts. And so really it's trying to bring the best value to customers by creating that competitive marketplace. So of course today, very recently, we have House Bill 951. This just passed about a month ago. And we now have the carbon plan, which will help us on our path to the 70% carbon emission reduction goal. I'll talk more about these as I move forward, but I think it's really exciting to kind of look at the history and the progress and see how far we've come and how the goals and targets keep growing and expanding. So I think it tells a really good story about what's happened in the state. thinking about the CPRE procurement, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I mentioned it's a 20-year term, and the resources that are eligible can be up to 80 megawatts. And the way those bids are structured is that the bidder would provide sort of a decrement to that avoided cost cap. So it includes, the network upgrades must also be below that avoided cost cap, but the bidder doesn't have to bid in the interconnection costs when they're thinking about their bid. We've been going through a few waves of this. We had tranche 1, which is already completed, and those PPAs are signed, and there are 520 megawatts that came from tranche 1. And then tranche 2 had 664 megawatts. And so we're working on our third tranche right now. This is all adding up to the overall target of 2,660 megawatts. And there was a stipulation about, if other legacy projects exceeded 3,500 megawatts, that would adjust the target accordingly. So with all of those adjustments in place, the current estimate, which will be updated in the coming weeks, is about 300 megawatts left to procure for tranche 3. So we're really in the thick of things for planning and getting ready to launch this last procurement to close out the CPRE target. So we've learned, here we go. One of the interesting things that we've learned in addressing this tranche 3 is really the importance of the timing of how the interconnection process works. Generally speaking, the RFP is very similar for tranche 3. It's essentially the same thing as it was for tranche 1 and tranche 2, but getting that cost estimate information about those system upgrades is really important to make sure that the project is still below that required avoided cost cap. And previously we had a serial process. So essentially you enter the queue, you have a queue number, and projects are reviewed pretty much in order. And the way the serial process worked, it was possible for a project to go on hold, and it caused congestion. It sort of backed things up, backed up projects that were behind others that were on hold in the queue. And so because of this congestion, it was sort of gumming up the works, slowing things down. And we looked to examples in other states about how to handle large volumes of interconnection. And the cluster study process has worked really well in a lot of places. And so after a large stakeholder effort and several years of crafting the plan, the queue reform work was approved by all 3 entities, the North Carolina Commission, the South Carolina Commission, and FERC, to make sure that there's alignment across all 3. And so now the interconnection process is a cluster study process. So there's a window to enroll, and then from that enrollment, all those projects are studied collectively. And so when upgrades are identified, the cost of those upgrades is allocated across the projects that contribute to that upgrade. So this, can be a much more efficient way of running your interconnection process, but it also has some set timeline requirements. Because we've filed with all 3 of these entities, to deviate from any of that requires approval across these entities. And so we have to be really specific and careful about how we craft the milestones and timelines for the procurement process to make sure that it's lining up with the right information from the interconnection process, to make sure that we have really solid cost estimates to incorporate into that bid evaluation process. So again, we've had tons of stakeholder meetings, not only on queue reform, but now on the tranche 3 process, because Duke started off thinking, well, we can align it with our transitional cluster, which is going on right now, or we can wait until next year with the next cluster, it's called the DICES cluster. And stakeholders provided a third option and said, well, you have the ability to create a separate resource solicitation cluster specifically, and there was a preference for that. So we've, I think, reached a nice compromise position that Duke's instating a resource solicitation cluster for this CPRE tranche 3. And it's essentially kind of wedging it between the transitional cluster and the DICES cluster. So again, we're up against some tight timelines. The devil's in the details with all the timing, but we're gonna open the bid window for tranche 3 in January, and the plan is that those winners would be announced for the RFP in July of 2022. So it's been a lot of interesting work to make sure that we're timing everything out correctly. But I think we've reached a good place, and we're getting ready to launch. So we're actually in a comment period right now for folks to read our RFP documents. So if you're interested, go out there and read it. Now to the topic that probably most of you have also heard about, because it's been in the news and certainly top of mind. It was just signed into law, I believe, October 13th. And HB 951 really provides a framework for a very broad clean energy transition. There are a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and so I'm not going to cover everything in detail, but I'll try to hit on some of the major parts and focus on the areas that I think would be of most interest to folks in the solar world. The target here for utilities is to reduce carbon emissions by 70% in the year 2030, and then to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So there's a lot of work and planning that goes into a transition like this. And some of the pieces of this puzzle include the coal retirement. And so the law also has a provision around the securitization of coal retirements. There's performance-based rates. And so this is essentially a different way of tracking the utilities' progress and sort of grading the utilities' work by incorporating additional elements into how the utility is evaluated really by the commission. There are provisions for renewable programs for customers, for those customers that want to purchase renewable energy or RECs, and making sure that there's access and ability to do that. We have on-bill repayments for energy efficiency investments for customers. And then this term here, blend and extend, it's a nickname for a concept that's related to those old PURPA contracts that I was talking about earlier. We have some older contracts with very lucrative rates, and the commission is directed to hold a stakeholder process to look at how we might lower some of those older, higher rates for customers, but also extending the life of those contracts and trying to find a win-win scenario between the customers and those facilities. So essentially, it would be a blended rate over an extended period of time, hence blend and extend. And let's see, I'm gonna go through a few more details on this next slide about 951. I think one of the interesting pieces is there's so much that's covered, and a lot of it has been pushed to the North Carolina Utilities Commission. They're going to be busier than they've ever been, particularly in 2022. There's a lot of actions and work streams coming out of this. So, of course, these targets are still under the principles of least cost planning and providing reliability and affordability to customers. And all of this will be considered in the carbon plan, as it's being called. The commission is required to publish a plan by the end of 2022 for how to meet these 2030 and 2050 targets. But the plan will be revisited over time. It's not just one and done. And of course, it will have inputs from the utility, from stakeholders. This will be a collaborative process. But to touch on some of these other areas, within the performance-based rulemaking work, there's a consideration for multi-year rate plans, and sort of helps the utility better plan for longer-term investments by aligning rates accordingly over multiple years. but it also caps the utility's return on the investments, such that if they overcollect by more than 50 basis points, that ends up getting refunded to customers. So it has some guardrails as well, and I think these are sort of major changes to how the whole process in the business works in North Carolina. So there's a lot to be reviewed and a lot to be established by the commission in establishing both the PBR, the performance-based regulations, and the multi-year rate plans. There's one piece that is for DEQ rather than the NCUC. The Department of Environmental Quality has a plan that they're supposed to submit by March that would ensure financing for solar decommissioning. This is sort of on the tail of a prior study that the DEQ did around decommissioning work for solar and energy storage. So I'll cover a few more details on this carbon plan. They're really directed, the commission is directed to use all the tools in the toolbox, consider power generation, T&D, grid modernization, energy storage, energy efficiency, DSM, or any other, new technology that might not be listed in the law. So it's really looking at all the tools in the toolbox, and will certainly require a lot of information and inputs from the utilities, because this is our, we do the planning, but then taking stakeholder feedback on how best to craft this moving forward. The plan will, be reviewed every 2 years, and so in those periodic reviews, it's of course appropriate to have new information, new costs, other progress that's been made in achieving this plan taken into consideration. So it gives the commission a lot of flexibility around how best to hit these goals and not compromise the reliability of the grid. And this kind of fleet transition is really a massive undertaking. So I think it's pretty exciting, but we are very much in the early days of what's to come. There is a provision that the commission may authorize a procurement for solar energy facilities in 2022. So that might be another short-term action that's taken, and there might be action on that even before we have the carbon plan, just because of the timing of when all these things sort of fall out and all the respective due dates. With that, I think I've covered all that I have to cover, and happy to take questions and move into that. I think with HB 951 and the carbon plan, there are many questions and not as many answers yet, since we're still just a month into having this law, but happy to answer what I can.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. And remember, we'll have Q&A here coming up shortly. So if you have any questions, please type those into the Q&A box that we talked about earlier. One quick thing I wanted to cover before we move on to that, in 2018, the IEEE released an updated version of the Distributed Resource Interconnection Standard 1547. A lot of changes in there. Utilities and commissions, of course, various stages of full adoption of this, but basically by allowing DERs to participate in grid support services and some of the other attributes will ultimately have the effect of enabling higher penetrations of solar and other distributed resources. Compliance and proper management of inverter settings are going to be of utmost importance to ensure grid reliability. Duke has been working with the industry stakeholders like Strata Clean Energy to evaluate settings as part of their interconnection commissioning program. And also Advanced Energy is participating with Duke, IEEE, and others in developing the IEEE Conformity Assessment Program, or ICAP, to ensure standards conformance, particularly as more complex aspects of the new IEEE 1547 standards are implemented in the future. So if there's any questions about that, feel free to type those in as well. So At this point, we are at our question and answer session, and we do have 10 minutes remaining, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We may not have time today to answer all the questions, or we may not have an immediate answer. In either case, we'll do our best to follow up with you after doing some research or finding the best resource for you. So looking at some of the questions that have come in, and we've had a few in the chat and some that were submitted ahead of time. And I'm going to go ahead and go to one of the questions that came in earlier about the generation capacity, and it's from Tom Phelps, and I believe it was about one of my slides, the graph showing nominal capacity, not actual generation. How does the graph change based on actual generation? You're right, it is based on the nominal installed capacity. I think the best other metric to go to answer that question would be really just the energy output. Obviously, that's the installed capacity that only occurs for a short period of time during the day when the sun's shining. So it's kind of hard to answer what the actual generation would be otherwise. I don't know, John, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered that, David. I think, yeah, that's, as I said when I spoke, that's an important distinction to make. The EIA is a great source for that. But yeah, I think you pretty much hit it.
Okay. Another question, I think, Mara, this is probably a good one for you or John. Can you discuss the study process for cluster studies? With respect to cluster studies, will all costs for the total system-wide upgrades be split between all developers, or will it be broken down into some sort of regional upgrades? Mara, can you?
Yes, I will say all of the nitty-gritty details are in the North Carolina interconnection procedures. So, by all means, that's the authority for the state jurisdictional projects. But at a higher level, the way the cluster studies work is that when an upgrade is identified, there is also a mechanism to determine which projects are contributing to causing that upgrade and how much each of them is contributing to that upgrade. And so there's an allocation across the projects that contribute to that. So it's more about the electrical geography rather than just the region from a mapping perspective. It really has to do with where the wires go and how the power flows. But so it's not so much that in the cluster all of the upgrades identified get spread to all of the projects there. It's really which projects are contributing to which upgrades. And there may be some projects that contribute to multiple upgrades, and there may be some projects that contribute to none of those upgrades. So I think the hope is that, for some instances where there are really high dollar upgrades, it might be difficult for one project alone to bear that cost. And that was how things were set up in the serial process. But now in a cluster, for a higher dollar upgrade, you can now spread that cost across multiple projects. And so the hope is that it can also get some of these upgrades more likely to be completed and move forward when that cost is shared across multiple projects.
Okay. Thanks. I hope that answered the question. Okay, one question that had been submitted ahead of time was, why is North Carolina so far behind on rooftop solar? I think I can take part of that being it's just the economics. I mean, if you look at Hawaii, which is by far the leader, where energy costs are approaching 40 cents a kilowatt hour, the economics are obviously a lot different than in North Carolina and also across the Southeast, where your energy cost average closer to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the other part that Mara may have already touched on, and I don't know, Mara, if you want to expand on it, is just the policy change, particularly that came out of House Bill 589, because that's when you started seeing the increase. So how did that, Mara, how did that really affect rooftop solar?
Well, I think from HB 589, we opened up solar leasing. And so that was a new opportunity for rooftop solar. And it also established the solar rebate program. And so having rebates, of course, that's playing to the economics of the project. So offering those rebates, I think, also helped spur more interest in rooftop solar, of course. Those rebates are actually still going on. We have 2 more waves coming up in January and July of 2022. But I think you're right. The payback period has so much to do with customers' choices around rooftop solar, and having lower rates also means a longer payback period for a rooftop solar installation.
Okay, thanks. Mara, another one I think will be good for you. What will be available in the infrastructure bill to help nonprofits begin integrating solar, and when will that be available?
Oh, if only I had a crystal ball. Um, I think I'm not sure that we have a clear answer about that. I think that everything from 951 and the indications that we have on the infrastructure bill show that we're moving in a cleaner direction, but I think the details really have yet to shake out. So I think there's certainly huge opportunities for solar and battery storage will be part of any large clean energy transition as well. But the details of how that will work, I think really are yet to come.
Okay, thanks. Another question had been submitted up. John, I'll pass this to you. Can you shed some light on backfeeding from solar? What's the issue with that?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, that's a concern often, asked about, and it's a kind of a different answer if you're talking about transmission or distribution. It's typically brought up in the distribution sense because, a lot of people are aware that the distribution system was initially really built to be radial in one direction, and so this is an issue that's been really in the midst of being tackled for really a couple of decades now because it's been brought up some time ago, even before solar. And probably the easiest thing to say about it right now, where we stand, and in North Carolina, is backfeed or reverse power flow, as it's sometimes called, which is on that radial system, that power going the other direction is it's happening. It's captured in studies when the utility does the study, and in many cases it's perfectly manageable. But I will say that from a distribution system perspective, I think, and based on some of my prior experience, I'm proud to say that I think in North Carolina we have learned more about this than probably in many places, and in some cases there are issues to be dealt with, and you can't you have to let the study guide you, as a good friend of mine used to say. Yep, kind of something along those lines. Let the study guide you. So study will tell you if the impacts are going to be negative or not. But in a lot of cases, we manage reverse power flow without any real specific issues.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'd agree. I think based on our experience over the years working together, that's about as good an answer as I think you can come up with. I think from the Hawaii perspective, particularly with rooftop solar, it can be a problem that sneaks up because you're not studying each individual interconnection. When you're looking at utility scale solar, you're doing a study, you're looking at the impact of that. But I know at one point in Hawaii, when it just took off, they had feeders on their system that had up to maybe 5 and 6 times the power flow than the daytime minimum load coming from generation. So that was beginning to cause a problem. And Hawaii's got the added problem of being an islanded grid. There's not this larger grid that they can absorb that extra. So I thank you for that.
Yes.
We are at about 1 minute till, so that's all the time, all the questions we'll have time to answer. So if we didn't get to your question, we'll be happy to reply directly to you. Hopefully some of you asked questions we didn't get to, maybe they were answered in the process of the presentation. So, but before we go, I want to thank everybody, extend our appreciation to all the stakeholders, the many people from Duke Energy, North Carolina's electric cooperatives, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, the public staff of the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and Dominion Energy, who provide their input and guidance to make this program a success, and particularly our guest speakers, John Gaida and Mara Favre. We also want to remind everyone to visit the NC Smart Grid website at ncsmartgrid.org, where you'll find recordings of all of our past Smart Grid webinars, and a recording of this one will be posted there in a few days. At this point, I'll end today's webinar by sharing our participation satisfaction survey. Be aware you'll see a warning message pop up that you're going to an external site. You can select continue and proceed to the survey. So please help us improve by filling out that survey so that we can continue to offer valuable information and resources to you. Once again, we're grateful that you took the time out of your day to join us for this webinar. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you at one of our future webinars. Thanks.